Good evening. My name is Frederick Vervaat and I'm a Roman historian in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies here. And I would like to begin this public lecture with an acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of the land in which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri Nation, and pay respect to their elders and families. Ladies and gentlemen, philosophers and philosophy enthusiasts, lovers of the ancient world, tonight I have the honor of introducing Professor Dan Russell on behalf of the Classics and Archaeology program in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies. I take a distinct pleasure in doing so, as I already enjoyed several engaging lunchtime discussions with Dan, and he has become a bit of a friend in the process. Though I still have to live up to my promise to having him and his family over for your typical Australian blowout. For those of you who are less familiar with Dan, apart from being Professor of Philosophy in Arizona Center for the Philosophy of Freedom at the University of Arizona, Tucson, we're also very happy indeed to have him here every other semester as the Percy Seymour Reader in Ancient History and Philosophy at Ormond College. And last but not least, as a supportive and active fellow in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Melbourne. Dan works at the fascinating intersection of ancient and moral philosophy, and his research focuses on living well, an acutely contemporary issue in an age of massive private and public debts, consumerism versus sustainability, and the challenges and costs associated with our current style of living. He has published extensively on such themes as personal excellence, human well-being, and relation between the two. Amongst other things, he is the author of Plato on Pleasure and the Good Life with Oxford, Practical Intelligence and the Virtues, Happiness for Humans, forthcoming, and as if that's not enough, he also happens to be the editor of the forthcoming Cambridge Companion to Virtue Ethics. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Professor Dan Russell on the intriguing subject of why the Stoics think there's no right way to grieve.
Thanks, Frederick. Well, where else but Australia does an American go to meet a Belgian for lunch, right? It's been great to get to know Frederick, and this was his idea, so I thank him, and I thank the Faculty of Arts as well for making it a possibility. I'll get straight in a moment. So as Groucho Marx once said, I think, before I speak to you, there are a few things I'd like to say. He mentioned a forthcoming title, so here's the shameless self-promotion bit of the evening. This book I've just finished, and it's coming out later this year. Now, I bring it up because the paper that I'm giving to you tonight is largely drawn from the final chapter of that book. It's a strange final chapter. Unless you're a philosopher, a good philosopher never takes yes for an answer. So after developing my view of what I think happiness is in the book, then the final chapter says, I just might be wrong about this. And here's why. Now, the notion of happiness that I talk about in this book is not happiness in the sense of a mood or a feeling, but rather happiness as something that a person wants for their whole life. The sense in which we may tell a newlywed couple, we wish you every happiness, right? That might include certain kinds of positive feelings, but I think we're really wishing a kind of future for them, a kind of life for them together. And that's the notion of happiness that I'm interested in the book. It's the one that ancient philosophers were interested in. Now, I say three things about it in the book. One is that it is something active, and in particular, that active life, the activity of it is for the sake of ends that give our life meaning, right? So finding things to live for and then living for them. Second, that it's in accordance with practical wisdom and emotional soundness, or for short, virtue. And third, that it's inextricable from the relationships and the other pursuits that make us who we are. Now, I'll draw your attention to these second and third items here. The question that I raise at the end of the book is this: can I really have it both ways? And I raise that question because it was the ancient Stoics who would look at that pairing and say, absolutely not. So theirs is a view that I have to reckon with. It's not a view that I accept, but it is one that I have an obligation to take very seriously. So that's why this discussion of their nature of grief because it's their view on grief that really does come at the intersection of these two ideas. One, that it's a good idea to get really attached to other people and projects, and the other, that we need to live in accordance with practical wisdom. So I'll begin. Character concerns both actions and emotions. Actions are what character chooses. Emotions are part of what character actually is. So if virtue is excellence of character, then virtue is excellence of emotion too. But here we face the difficult task of knowing what kind of emotional makeup is excellent and what kind is defective. For instance, you and I probably agree that grief is often a healthy response to serious loss. By contrast, the Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome argue that there's no healthy way to grieve, and that we should all work to make ourselves less susceptible to grief in the first place. Now, like most modern readers, I don't follow the Stoics in this belief, but unlike most modern readers, I do think that the Stoics have a point that we shouldn't miss. According to the Stoics, what makes us susceptible to grief is our staking our well-being in life on anything outside our immediate control. Why shouldn't we stake our well-being in that way? Because doing so, the Stoics say, is the main way that people jeopardize their character, their freedom, and even their very humanity. And I worry that they just may have a point. Now I want to say what that point is, and to do so I shall focus on the discussion of grief that we find in Cicero, who reports the Stoic view, and especially in the later Stoic philosopher Epictetus. Now, after setting up the basic issue that the Stoics find worrying about grief, I'll develop that worry first by looking at the larger context of Stoic psychology of emotion, and then their treatment of grief specifically. I'll then show how Epictetus completes the Stoic case against being susceptible to grief, and I'll conclude with some remarks about why the things that worry Epictetus should give us pause as well. Happy people grieve. I don't mean that grief makes people happy, of course. I mean that part of having a rich, happy life is finding things to live for and then living for them, and that means making the sorts of connections that give us something to lose in the first place. When we lose those connections, we grieve. But in a way, that's the point of making those connections in the first place. Happy people grieve because they have found things to lose. Now here's a story to show you what I mean. In the film Shadowlands, C.S. Lewis, or Jack to his friends, is faced with the impending death of his beloved wife, Joy. Jack's life before meeting Joy had been comfortable, safe, and always familiar. In fact, he first found Joy attractive because she was unafraid to point out that his life was too safe, and that a real challenge would do him a lot of good. And she was right. Joy was an equal to be reckoned with, and she filled Jack's life with passion, closeness, and real challenges. But now, Joy is dying, and she tells Jack something interesting. We can't have the happiness of yesterday without the pain of today. That's the deal. Question: if that's the deal, why do we take the deal? Perhaps it's a matter of cost-benefit analysis. We subtract the pain of tomorrow from the happiness today and see whether we come out at a gain or a loss. Well, maybe there's something to that, but I think it better explains the times when we don't take the deal. When we do take the deal, I think the deal we're taking is committing to care and desire and cherish in such a way that there is something to be lost. That certainly was the point for Jack. Joy had been close to death once before, when she and Jack weren't yet married, and the first time Jack realized he loved Joy was when he imagined how he would feel if this dying woman were his wife. If she were his wife, he said, he would love her. She'd be the most important thing to him in the world, and the thought of her dying would be utter torment. And that was when Jack admitted to himself that that was exactly how he did feel. It was also when Jack realized he had to marry Joy. For Jack, the point of being Joy's lover was to have her in his life precisely because the loss of her could touch him that deeply. Before Joy, Jack's life was so comfortable that there wasn't much he could lose, and that was the problem. Solving that problem by loving Joy was a way of giving himself a happy life, and the vulnerability he brought upon himself was not the cost of that solution, but really what made it a solution at all. Now, that's all on one side. Now let me tell you another story, this one from Tom Wolfe's novel, A Man in Full. It's the story of Charlie Croker, an aging commercial real estate developer and one of the richest men in Atlanta, Georgia. And his empire is on the verge of collapse owing to a debt of over $500 million in mid-1990s dollars. Money he had used to build a massive office building, Croker Concourse, named in an apparent fit of megalomania. And it now sits mostly empty. Charlie's creditors have begun seizing his assets, and they're moving from cutting fat to cutting into muscle and bone. What hits Charlie the hardest is their threat to seize his country plantation home, the place that Charlie has stocked with all the things that create his perception of himself as a real man. Not so much the opulent houses and private jets, but the quail hunts, the thoroughbred studs, the raw earthiness and general masculine atmosphere of the antebellum South. It's here, on this plantation of all places in the world, that Charlie most feels he is a man in full. And Charlie is about to lose it all. Well, one day a young lawyer comes to Charlie and tells him that some of the most powerful people in Atlanta are offering to pressure Charlie's creditors to restructure his debt. And Charlie's ready to listen. In exchange for this generous help, the lawyer explains, Charlie will have to make a public statement on behalf of the lawyer's client, whose case could potentially turn all of Atlanta upside down. That's why there's so much power behind it. The trouble is, Charlie doesn't find this client worth speaking for. And even worse, to speak on his behalf would be to betray a friend and business associate whose daughter it is that the lawyer's client is accused of having sexually assaulted. For a while, Charlie just tries to avoid the problem, going in for a knee operation he'd been putting off, and consequently being laid up in bed incapacitated. But eventually the lawyer and the city's power brokers corner him. And ultimately he has no choice but to make his statement, since otherwise he'll lose everything he owns, and with it everything that makes him the man he takes himself to be. Now, like Jack, Charlie has found things to live for, things that give him something to lose. But those things don't give Charlie a happy life. Actually, they're threatening to ruin his life, and they rob him of his freedom. And yet, what is it to be susceptible to grief in the first place, but to have the sorts of connections to things outside one's control that Charlie, and let's be clear, Jack, actually have? Being susceptible to grief means staking one's happiness on something one might lose, but doing that creates inroads for other people, or just bad luck, to take control of our emotions and actions. It's here that a situation like Charlie's, and Jack's too for that matter, becomes the sort of thing that the Stoic philosopher Epictetus talks about all the time. If I place value on my body, he says, I've given myself up as a slave. If on my miserable property, I'm a slave likewise. For I immediately show to my own detriment how I may be taken. Now that's what Charlie has done. By pinning his happiness on things outside his control, he's announced to everyone the means by which they can control him. And Epictetus would say that Jack, in his way, has done precisely the same thing. As long as Charlie takes his happiness to lie in those things, there's nothing else he can do. He has no choice but to do what others would manipulate him into doing. This puts him at the mercy of circumstance, and so he becomes anxious, sleepless, extremely depressed. He stands to lose his entire fortune. Consequently, he's also at the mercy of anyone who might be able to work those circumstances against him, which is exactly what the city's power brokers come after him in the first place. Now, Epictetus would say that the more general point to be made here is that a man's master is whoever has the authority over the things that a man desires to get for him or to take them away. Have we so many masters then? We have. For prior to all human masters, circumstances are masters, and they're many. It necessarily follows then that those who have power over any of these circumstances are also our masters. When we love and hate and fear these things, those who have the disposal of them must necessarily be our masters. His point is that the threat of losing what could be taken away is a major source, I think he would say the major source, of all of our wrongdoing, anxiety, and misery in life. So perhaps we should say instead that happy people won't grieve, because what well-being really requires is that we not stake our well-being on things that can make us susceptible to grief in the first place. Okay, on to point number 2. Now, not just Epictetus, but Stoic philosophers in general argue that grief is an unhealthy emotion and we shouldn't be susceptible to it in the first place. The Stoics take a radical position here, and they know it, but it's important to be clear on just what's radical here and what isn't. Depictions of the Stoics are often cartoons. And if we know the Stoics mainly from the cartoons, we'll probably think that they reject the emotional part of our nature completely. In fact, the English word Stoic actually suggests just that. In the cartoons, then, the Stoics think that grief is unhealthy just because it's an emotion, and that's the end of it. But that is just the cartoon, and the Stoics themselves say explicitly that it's a gross distortion of their view. What the Stoics do say is, 1, that there are such things as disordered emotions, and 2, that the only thing to do with those disordered emotions is to get rid of them altogether. Now, emotions are disordered on their view insofar as they're paired with a broader worldview that attaches the wrong kind of value to things. And about that much, I think they have to be right. Think about the emotional life of a hoarder. Someone who holds on to old junk as if his well-being somehow depended on it. Now, emotions like that are inseparable from an outlook on the world that's seriously unhealthy and deeply mistaken. We have to get rid of those emotions because we have to get rid of the whole unhealthy worldview that they're part of. Now, it's important to appreciate that the Stoics don't take emotions to be the same thing as feelings exactly. For instance, when someone jumps out and shouts boo, you might have the initial feeling of fear without actually fearing for your safety. Feelings like that, the Stoics agree, we can't do very much about. So when they say that we should get rid of certain emotions, they don't mean we should do away with these sorts of visceral reactions. We can't do away with them anyway. Rather, by an emotion, a Stoic understands a complex reaction to situations that's inseparable from one's larger outlook on the significance of one's situation. Since some outlooks should be thrown out and replaced, on their view, the same is true of emotions. We can think of this throwing out and replacing as a process of emotional maturation. Growing up, after all, isn't just becoming a taller child, but putting away childish things, as Paul put the point, and gradually taking on a new, mature outlook on the world. That's the sort of change that the Stoics think takes place in our emotional lives. We put away one way of looking at the world and the emotions that go with it, and we take on a new, more mature outlook with different and more mature emotions. The Stoics think that the sort of maturation that amounts to becoming fully human, practically wise and emotionally sound, just is the development of the virtues of character, and they distinguish the emotions of virtuous and vicious people, even in their very names, to emphasize their belief that virtuous and vicious persons have radically different emotional lives. Virtuous people, on their view, are the ones who put aside an unhealthy outlook, but something else goes in its place, a healthier, more realistic outlook, and the emotions that naturally go with that. Now, there's more that can be said about Stoic psychology, quite clearly. But if you agree with them on that much, then for the purposes of what we'll talk about here, you agree with enough. So on to point number 3. Now, here another question arises. Granting that some emotions are disordered, and that susceptibility to them is a defect, just which emotions are these? This is the point at which the Stoic position becomes radical, holding not just that there are such things as disordered emotions, but more specifically, that grief is one of them. Here we shift from describing our psychology to reflecting on what is psychologically better or worse. In particular, what sorts of emotional susceptibility are good or bad for us. When the Stoics say that grief is always disordered, they don't mean to deny that some cases of grief go a lot better for the person than other cases of grief. What they have in mind is something deeper than that. In order to be the sort of person who might experience grief at all, of any sort, they think, one must already have an outlook on the world that's deeply misguided. That outlook, the Stoics say, should be pulled up like a weed in its very roots and fibers. So what's supposed to be wrong with that outlook? Well, Cicero offers a valuable summary of the Stoics' position on grief in the third and fourth books of his Tusculan Disputations. Now, according to Cicero, the main goal of the Stoics' philosophy of grief is to convince people to fortify themselves against any possible degradation of character. What he takes them to argue is this: those outlooks that make us prone to grieve also obstruct our ability to act virtuously. In fact, Cicero summarizes no fewer than 7 Stoic arguments for this conclusion. Susceptibility to grief, the Stoics say, exposes us to worry and fear, but what we need is courage. It makes us feel weak, where what we need is greatness of soul. It makes it difficult for us to see what to do, but what we need is wisdom. It makes us prone to get upset and flustered, but what we need is level-headed temperance. It makes us susceptible to resentment, spitefulness, and envy, but these are all foolish ways of relating to each other. This, Cicero says, is how the Stoics state the case. Now, there are 2 things that we should notice about these arguments. The first is that they are breathtakingly quick. I've compressed them here to save time, but actually not by all that much. These come in the space of a paragraph. Cicero is clearly drawing on much fuller Stoic arguments, but he presents them only in the quickest thumbnail sketches, and the result is that, well, they're not very convincing. But second, and more important at present, Cicero's discussion does give us an important clue about the basic structure of the Stoic case against being susceptible to grief. An outlook on our well-being that would make us susceptible to grief, they argue, is an outlook we can't live with because such an outlook makes us worse people. We can't both hold on to the outlook that makes grief seem a reasonable response to loss, they argue, and be ever ready to live with practical wisdom and emotional soundness. But of course, here the question is, why? Why does grief put us at so much risk, as they think that it does? Well, that brings us to number 4. When we go to Epictetus, we get some interesting insights that fill in the details. Epictetus' argument here is surprisingly simple. And here it is. He thinks you will protect what you think your well-being depends on, and if you think your well-being depends on things that you cannot control, then you will become a target for coercion by anyone who does have control over those things, and even by circumstances themselves. In other words, pinning your well-being on anything outside your control means abandoning the very autonomy that's crucial to your humanity, and therefore to your real prospects for human well-being. Now, Epictetus illustrates this point with a number of stories. One of these is the myth of Medea, especially in Euripides' play about Medea, who murders her 2 young sons despite their father Jason for his betrayal of her. Now, even this most outrageous act, Epictetus says, is really just a case of someone doing what she thinks is her best option. As long as Medea thinks that revenge is her best option, there's nothing else for her to do. And so as long as she has the attitudes about her husband and her situation that she has, revenge at all costs just will seem to her to be her best option. And so by having those attitudes, she yields to her circumstances a terrible control over her action. Another story concerns a man who's been summoned by Nero to perform in one of the plays that he used to write, specifically for the purpose of pressuring certain citizens into taking a role in them, so that he could then write a role that would humiliate them to enact. Surprisingly, the man's Stoic friend tells him that he may as well perform in Nero's play. After all, he's already begun to consider it, weighing up the value of things outside his control, and in doing that, he's already given Nero all the power over him that he was after, namely the power to make him put a price on his own free will, the only thing he can control. More specifically, Epictetus' case rests on 3 basic claims, or so I argue. One, that people tend to do what they judge as their best option. Two, that making well-being depend on things outside one's control threatens one's autonomy. And three, that autonomy is crucial to our humanity and thus to our well-being. So let me look at each of these more closely. Let's take the first. Epictetus says that people tend to do what they judge to be their best option, best here being best for the sake of their well-being. He thinks that people tend to act this way for the very simple reason that choosing to do what one judges to be one's best option just is part of what it is to have ordinary practical rationality. Now, notoriously, Epictetus argues that even Medea does just what she thinks is her best option. She's not crazed or irrational, he argues, but an ordinary case of practical rationality. Given her priorities, she arrived at a correct judgment of her best option. And it's precisely that option that she chose. It was because she was unable to endure not getting what she desired that Medea came to murder her own children. The action of a noble spirit, in this regard at least, that she had a proper impression of what it means to be disappointed in one's desire. Now, of course, Medea's judgment was also deeply incorrect in the sense that it began from the wrong priorities, and more realistic priorities would have led her to a completely different judgment about her options. This is the error of a great soul, he writes, a soul with great vigor. For she knew not where the power to do what she wished lies, that it's not to be acquired from outside ourselves, nor by altering or disarranging things. If we insist on calling her irrational, it must be that she had the wrong attitudes. She had no mistakes at all in figuring out what followed from the attitudes she had. Now, we observe the very same practical rationality in Charlie Croker as well. While Charlie recovers from his knee operation, he encounters Connie, a young in-home therapy worker who's recently started reading Epictetus and is trying to live his life by it as best as he can. Now, Charlie asks Connie in the abstract about a dilemma like his, and Connie replies that Epictetus would say it's selling out to let others manipulate him in order to avoid some catastrophe. Charlie finds that a fine idea, but in real life he's terrified. So he asks Connie this. This is all very noble in the abstract, all this your man is saying. But what does it have to do with real life? Let's think about real life for a second. Let's think about a situation in which you lose everything. You lose everything. You see what I'm saying? You lose everything. The house where you live, your income, your cars, everything. You're out on the street. You don't know where your next meal's coming from. What good do a lot of high-sounding ideals mean then? And the boy said, many of Epictetus's disciples asked him that exact same thing, and you know what he told them? No, what? Have you ever seen an old beggar? The kid's eyes were boring right into him. You asking me? Yes. Sure I have. Plenty of them. See? They've gotten by, said the boy. They've managed to get food to eat. 365 days a year, probably. They're not starving. What makes you think they can all find food? And you wouldn't be able to. Well, predictably, what kind of consolation is that supposed to be? I'd rather die than go around with a cup in my hand. The boy smiled and his eyes brightened. Epictetus talks about exactly that, Mr. Croker. He says, you're not afraid of starving. You're afraid of losing face. And yet if it happened, it wouldn't be nearly as bad as you think, Mr. Croker. Now, Connie's point is that the reason Charlie would rather die than go bankrupt has nothing to do with survival and everything to do with pride. In fact, that's just what Charlie had said at the beginning of their conversation when he asked Connie this question. What does Epictetus have to say about bankruptcy, or is that too mundane for a philosopher to think about? Not too mundane for Epictetus, Mr. Croker. One place he says, you're all nervous and you can't sleep at night for fear you're going to run out of money. You say, how will I ever get enough to eat? But what you're really afraid of isn't starvation, but the prospect of not having a cook, or somebody to wait on you at the dinner table, or somebody to take care of your clothes and your shoes and the laundry and make up the beds and clean up the house. In other words, you're afraid you may no longer be able to lead the life of an invalid. That is what Epictetus says, and guess where Charlie is when he reads this to him? Lying in bed with his knee recovering because he couldn't face the lawyers. And that's exactly what Charlie is afraid of. He thinks he can't live without his servants and minions and private jets and racehorses and mansions and plantation, not because he'd literally die, but because no life without them would be a life for him. In other words, his worry isn't that there might be no life after bankruptcy, but that bankruptcy would take away the Charlie Croker that he is. So Charlie is in the same situation as Medea. He may well be mistaken about how he weighs up good and bad options, but he makes no mistake at all about what follows from how he currently weighs his options up. In that sense, in Charlie, as in Medea, we see a noble spirit and great vigor. He understands what his best option is, given the things that he cares about. Now, Epictetus's second main idea is a corollary of the first. Since humans tend to do what they judge to be their best option for preserving their well-being, humans can be manipulated by whatever or whoever can dispose of things they take to be important for their well-being, which they cannot control themselves. That's how pressure comes to be exerted on Charlie in the first place. It's taken as given that Charlie will do what he must to preserve his well-being, and it's taken as given that he judges his property and social position to be necessary for his well-being. But now someone else is in control of Charlie's property and his position. And so the city's power brokers reckon that because they can control Charlie's property, they can control Charlie. And they're dead right, as long as Charlie lacks control over something he can't do without and is rational enough to see what follows from that. Now, ironically, it's Charlie's very autonomy and rationality that get him into this trap. It's up to no one but Charlie to decide what sort of importance he will attach to his property and position. As Epictetus asks rhetorically, can anyone compel you to have any opinion contrary to your will? And because he's rational, Charlie can appreciate that he must do whatever it takes to preserve whatever he gives that importance. In such cases, Epictetus says that choice compels choice. Can anyone restrain you from assenting to truth? No one. Can anyone compel you to admit a falsehood? No one. You see then that you have in this area a choice incapable of being restrained or compelled or hindered. Well, is it any otherwise with regard to impulse and desire? What can overpower one impulse but another impulse? What can overpower desire and aversion but another desire and aversion? But if a person inflicts the fear of death upon me, someone says, he compels me. No. It's not what's inflicted upon you that compels you, but your own judgment that it's better to do such and such a thing than to die. Here again, you see that it's your own judgment that compelled you. That is, choice compelled choice. So consequently, the choice to bind one's well-being to something outside one's control ultimately leaves one trapped into doing whatever one must to keep hold of it. This means that a person who binds his well-being only to the right use of reason is also compelled to do whatever he must to keep hold of that. But of course, what he's thereby compelled to do is only to act in accordance with right reason. Such a person can't become anyone's tool, and that's the point. Epictetus' third and final premise is that autonomy is crucial for our humanity, and therefore for our well-being. Human beings, unlike other animals, need to live lives that are genuinely their own, and they thus need the freedom to live by exercising practical reasoning, experiencing complex emotions, making choices, and living with the implications of their choices. Moreover, whatever human well-being is, it must be something distinctly human, and so must be the well-being of a creature that is such as to live autonomously. Now, this third idea soaks in for Charlie Croker as well. Until his encounter with Connie, and through Connie, Epictetus, Charlie had assumed, with those putting pressure on him, that he really had no choice. If it takes making a statement for Charlie to keep from losing everything, and no attempts at evasion will succeed, then he has no choice but to make a statement. And as Connie points out, this is exactly the sort of predicament that Epictetus supposes his listeners are usually in. They're trapped. However, Epictetus argues that although people are often enslaved and trapped, no one is ever trapped unless he is complicit. Those who are pressuring Charlie can trap him only as long as Charlie remains attached to the things they threaten to take away from him. And that attachment is ultimately up to Charlie. Charlie is awestruck by the realization that even here, in the midst of all this pressure and impending financial and social ruin, he might still have the option of living on his own terms. For Epictetus, that kind of realization is the first step towards living a life that can properly be called human. Now, the conclusion that Epictetus draws from all of this is that well-being requires that we not take things we cannot control to be important for our well-being. You must, I adjure you by the gods, cease to admire material things and cease to make yourselves slaves, first of things and then on their account of the men who have the power, either to bestow them or take them away. The only way for Charlie to free himself from his trap is to undo his ensnaring choices about what his happiness requires and be prepared instead to lose anything he can't control. That's the only way to remain truly autonomous. So, in summary, here is how Epictetus completes the Stoic case against being susceptible to grief. An outlook that makes our well-being dependent on things we can't control is an outlook we can't live with, in Epictetus's view. It's an outlook we ought to eradicate. However, it's just that sort of outlook that makes us susceptible to grief. That is why, as Cicero says, that susceptibility ought to be eradicated too. In a word, grief is part of an outlook on our lives that the Stoics believe has the potential to ruin everything for us. Last bit, number 5. How seriously do we have to take Epictetus' argument? What I think is really the most likely thing to bother us about Epictetus' argument is the sense that he's simply too extreme in thinking about the dangers we face in staking our well-being in things we cannot control. Surely we could have agreed with Epictetus if he had just said to beware the line between being appropriately vulnerable to circumstances and being so vulnerable and fragile that we become rationally and emotionally impaired. But the worry is that Epictetus seems to have denied any such line at all between some sort of appropriate vulnerability and serious ethical peril. However, I think there is a lesson to take from Epictetus that's a lot more subtle than that. Even granting that there is such a line, surely it matters how good we actually are at keeping our balance along that line. This question is all the more challenging when we remind ourselves that staying on the right side of that line isn't at all like solving a problem. It's a matter of holding on to our wisdom, our emotional balance, and our freedom when what's at stake are things to which we are attached as if our well-being depends on it. The point, I think, can be put not as the absolute certainty that from such attachments it follows that one must necessarily fall into ruin, but as a point about human psychology that such attachments expose us to risks that just are where suffering, impairment, and unfreedom actually do come from. Now, perhaps we'll think that Epictetus is too extreme in another way, though. Epictetus writes in and for a culture in which a person's prospects routinely are down to the discretion of some patron or autocrat. In such a world, it's clear that the surrender of one's autonomy is an ever-present threat and that it's always dangerous to stake very much well-being on things outside one's control. It's in this spirit that I think Admiral James Stockdale said to himself as he found himself parachuting into enemy territory in Vietnam that he was leaving his own world and entering the world of Epictetus. But perhaps the strength of Epictetus's view in desperate circumstances is its greatest weakness everywhere else. Epictetus's objection might have teeth in Stockdale's circumstances, or Charlie Croker's, or Medea's. But most of us will never be in circumstances remotely like those. Why should we take Epictetus's worries seriously? Actually, Epictetus addresses this question directly. Suppose he imagines someone saying that my ambition is to become a senator, to go to Rome, to hold some public office. In that case, Epictetus, you may have a point. It's clear how present the danger is of losing my freedom in pursuing something so far outside my control. But suppose that I don't want to go to Rome. Suppose that I don't want to be a senator. Suppose instead that all I want is to stay in my hometown, live a quiet life of study, read my books, and lead the rest of the world to itself. What danger could I possibly be in then? Surprisingly, Epictetus says that the danger hasn't changed at all. The value you place on an external object, whatever it may be, makes you subservient to another. What difference does it make then, whether you desire to be a senator or not to be a senator? If you attach value to anything outside the sphere of choice, you destroy that choice. Anything that we stake our well-being on can become a source of unfreedom, Epictetus says, if that thing is something we can't control. We can lose our freedom to other people who threaten or offer what we desire, and we can lose our freedom even to circumstances. If you have your heart set on a life of quiet study, what else can you do but be upset when you can't get books, or can't find the time to read, or are faced with distractions? Likewise for staying home rather than going to Rome. If you make your happiness depend on staying home, what can you do but be upset when you find yourself having to go to Rome anyway? Perhaps this won't move you to murder anyone or betray a friend, but it might lead you to do other things that harm your relationships or leave you at the mercy of your emotions. In fact, maybe it's always this sort of attachment that's responsible for that sort of harm, that lack of control. And yet this sort of attachment is absolutely everywhere in our lives. But here we're likely to wonder again whether Epictetus is making such attachments too extreme. It's one thing to say that living in a certain city, say, is part of one's well-being, and it's another to think that it's part of one's well-being to live in that city at any cost. So for all that Epictetus has said, there can still be a line between rationally fighting for one's well-being and fighting so much that one ruins everything. However, I think that here too, there is a much more subtle way of taking Epictetus' point. Even if there is such a line, again, doesn't it matter how good we actually are at finding that line? In fact, comparing the task to finding a line gives far too much credit to our abilities. Striking a balance here isn't like solving a problem in geometry. It's a matter of struggling to be wise and balanced about things we're utterly passionate about, things to which we're committed as if our well-being depends on them, things for which we cannot but fight, things whose loss would be a loss of some part of ourselves. This, I think, is Epictetus' point, and we see it in his treatment of Medea. He quotes Medea's line in Euripides' play, "Yes, I understand what terrible things I'm about to do, but anger takes charge of my deliberations." Notice then that Medea recognizes that somewhere there's a line between acting for the sake of something and acting for its sake at all costs, and that one way of describing her impending act is that it crosses that line. However, anger offers another way of describing her act, to take vengeance on someone who's injured and wronged me. And that's the description that she goes with. What else could she have done, Epictetus asks, since she sees the loss of her husband as such a very great loss? This, he says, is just what it is to desire something and be disappointed about losing it. Now, I don't think that Epictetus means that anyone who loves another, as if his or her well-being depends on it, will therefore be capable of murder. He doesn't mean that the grave things we see in tragedies will also happen to us, but he does want us to see in tragedies a basic human problem, the difficulty of sticking to right reason when we're committed to things we can't control, and that's a problem we face every day. Nor, I think, does Epictetus' point rest on extreme thinking about how we fare when we face that problem. Most days simply aren't worth writing a tragedy about. But anxieties and failures to act well also tend to be part of our daily experience, and how many of those failures are down to our assumptions about what our well-being depends on. And that, I think, was the point that Cicero was originally getting at. We protect and cling to persons as if our happiness depends on them. And so we also worry and fear as if our happiness depends on them. We see how much control our circumstances and other people have over the things we want as if our happiness depends on them. And we feel powerless and small. We need to be ready to exercise right reason, but we find it difficult to see our way clearly because our attachment to things outside our control has taken on a life of its own. We become upset over things we can't control, and we're not at our best when we need to be. We worry about what others might do to keep us from those things, and we become suspicious and resentful. We won't be parted from those things, and we become possessive, jealous, and spiteful of other people. These are the ways in which we fall short every day in practical wisdom and emotional balance. According to Epictetus, they aren't lapses of practical reasoning. On the contrary, they're just how practical reasoning works when we adopt certain assumptions about our well-being. To conclude, where does this leave us? For my own part, I take Jack Lewis's view of things in the end rather than Epictetus's view of things. But here's why I think Epictetus's view is so important. It shows me that to take my view really is to embrace one horn of a dilemma. Epictetus embraces the other horn of avoiding the dangers that susceptibility to grief brings by not having anything to grieve for. Like Jack Lewis, I too think that real happiness means making one's happiness depend on people and things we can't control. It means having something to lose, something to grieve for when it's lost. Perhaps you think that way too. My point, though, is that we cannot take that way of thinking for granted. It's a choice that I make, with some faith and much trepidation, the choice to try to find my way along that line between intimacy and disaster. In other words, I don't take my view because I suppose that somehow I have proved that it's true. I believe it because I have chosen to accept the risks on this side of the dilemma over the risks on the Stoic side. Understanding well-being, I think, turns out to be a matter of dealing with a dilemma. And as with any dilemma, the best we can hope for is to make a choice we can live with. Thank you. And thanks to all of these people as well.